Hi everyone, I'm Jan Wegener and welcome back to the Early Bird Photo News. I was going to make another tutorial video, but we're about to be hit by a cyclone, so I thought it's probably better to just do a quick news video. So far, it's not too bad. We just had a little bit of wind and rain, but you definitely want to be careful when doing photo shoots at the beach. The Gold Coast and Brisbane had already a lot of wind and rain, so fingers crossed it's not too bad up here, and also that there's not too much damage in all the other areas and that everyone affected is safe and that there's not too much damage to property as well. Over the last few weeks, Sigma has definitely been in everyone's mouth, releasing a few quite unique products. First of all, their quite strange BF camera that's made from one piece of metal and has a very minimalist style with only the very functional buttons that you need on a camera. Probably not something for me, but looking at the YouTube videos, it definitely looks like an interesting piece of equipment that's almost similar to what Apple has done with the iPhone, for instance. Is that a camera that would interest you guys? And secondly, which is probably more interesting for us wildlife photographers, is Sigma's new f4 300 to 600mm zoom lens. It's definitely quite heavy and has a minimum focusing distance of 4.5 meters or around 15 foot. But at the same time, this is a flexibility and aperture speed that we've basically never seen in a lens like this before. What's great about the Sigma is that it comes with a built-in Arca Swiss foot, unlike all the other brands. So for many Sony and L-mount photographers, this is definitely an exciting piece of glass. Of course, there's some drawbacks, like you can't use teleconverters with Sony cameras and you're limited to 15 frames per second, but on many cameras like an A7R5, on A7R4, or an A7 IV, you'd get some really good use out of that camera, and you're also not limited by the frame rate because those cameras only shoot 10 frames per second anyways. But I didn't want to bore you with too many things that you already know, because I came across a website where someone was able to take a lot of sample shots with that Sigma lens. Now I must admit their settings are kind of strange, so I would take the image quality with a grain of salt. For instance, they were shooting at ISO 125, wide open at f4, and then relatively low shutter speed, so that's definitely something that seems a little bit off. But at the same time, they're full-size JPEG test files, so we should have a look. But when we have a look at these files, we can actually see that they all look somewhat soft and not super high quality. So hopefully these sample shots were just taken in a rush and are not indicative of what the lens can actually do in the field, because if I look at any of these test shots, they look rather soft. But because this is a lens that many of you are also very interested in, I'm already talking to Sigma and I'm hopeful that I might be able to get a lens to do a review for all of you guys. The other day, I've also met someone who owns a few camera shops here in Australia, and it was a very interesting conversation for me because I tried to kind of feel out what was going on in the world of photography on that camera shop level, and I had two very interesting takeaways. He said the majority of their gear they're selling is Canon based, and also that one lens in particular is selling like hotcakes, and that's the 200 to 800mm lens. He says basically it's impossible to get stock of the lens, and most of the time it's already back ordered. And if they ever have that lens on the shelf, it's usually sold within a week or two. So it seems like Canon has really hit a nerve with that 200 to 800mm lens, and I must admit, I enjoy that lens as well. It's not the sharpest lens in the world, but it's nice and lightweight, and you just have a lot of fun with it in the field because you have that amazing zoom range and good image stabilization. So it's basically a lens that you can always take with you and just take pictures whenever you want. And I think this is also the reason why Sony released their 400 to 800mm lens, which is a slightly different concept with a higher price point and a bigger size and weight. But at the same time, it seems like the Canon 200 to 800 was taking so many sales away, maybe from the 200 to 600, that Sony really felt like they should also push a lens into that 800mm range, which of course is amazing for us nature and wildlife photographers, because that 600 to 1000mm range is where we do a lot of our damage, isn't it? And if you haven't watched my review of the 200 to 800 or especially the 400 to 800mm lens yet, that's something you should definitely do after finishing this video. When we're using these slower lenses in the field, one thing we have to push for sure to get enough shutter speed is our ISO. And oftentimes if you have a lens that's wide open at f8 or f9 or even f11, you will have to use ISO of 3200, 6400 or even 12800 on a regular basis to ensure that your images are nice and sharp and you're freezing the action with high enough shutter speeds. And this is where good editing and noise reduction workflow comes into play. So of course, editing is always important to get the most out of your raw files, but especially if you use one of these slower lenses, it becomes even more important. Because with the right editing and noise reduction techniques, we can take a dark, underexposed, noisy file and turn it into a beautiful, sharp, and bright, final-looking image. And I would love to help you to make editing much easier and more fun for you with my Lightroom and Next Generation Photoshop Masterclasses. In these classes, I will teach you step by step and in easy-to-follow chapters the tricks and techniques you need to know to develop your own workflow that will guarantee you great results. But you won't just be watching, because I'm also providing you with my own raw files so you can edit right alongside me. And if you're not sure if the classes are the right fit for you or worth it, check out some of the amazing reviews that I receive on a daily basis from many happy people who I've already helped to transform their editing lives. So if you want to transform editing from a frustrating chore into a rewarding experience because now you know exactly what to do and have an easy to follow workflow, make sure to check out my Lightroom and Next Generation Photoshop Masterclasses down there in the description. It makes me very happy to see that my classes have been helping so many of you already. The other day I asked all of you on my Instagram account to send me some questions for my upcoming video with Dwayne, and one of the main questions that surprised me was, how are you traveling with your flex shooter tripod heads and are you still using them? To me, these are probably the best tripod heads you can find on the market for bigger and smaller lenses because they're so versatile and they're so small and easy to travel with. You just loosen the lever on top, put your lens on it, and it's basically acting like a gimbal, but at the same time, it can also act like a ball head. So for instance, oftentimes on my secondary tripod, I have this smaller flex shooter mini tripod head. So if I'm filming myself with a smaller camera, I can put the smaller camera on here and use the ball head function. And at the same time, I can also put a bigger lens like a 200-800 or even my 600mm prime lens on here if I need to film with that. So if you're on the market for a new tripod head, I would look at these flex shooter heads because they're so small, lightweight, and easy to use in the field. They don't have as much range as a gimbal head, for instance, but at the same time, I think the small size and the versatility definitely makes up for it. And for most people, this flex shooter mini head might actually be enough. Especially if you have like a Sony 400-800 or a Canon 200-800mm lens, this would definitely be enough, or maybe like a Nikon 600mm PF lens. If you have a bigger heavy prime lens, or maybe think about getting that Sigma lens, this bigger flex shooter Pro is probably better, but I've even used my f4 600mm prime lens on this smaller head and it still works very well. So all in all, when it comes to tripod heads, these are definitely my favorite heads at the moment, and I've used them in many different conditions and so far I had no problems at all. I don't know how they work maybe in super cold conditions if they tighten up a little bit, but so far whenever I've used them, they worked really great and I love them. One thing I found quite surprising and a little bit disappointing to see was that Nikon released a new firmware update for the Z6 III. Now, not because I don't like firmware updates, but because that firmware update did not include the bird's eye tracking autofocus. And lower end cameras like the Z52 already have had that autofocus for a long time. So it seems like Nikon is either not willing or able to include the bird eye tracking in the Z6 III. To me, that is definitely a bit of a downer because I think that camera could greatly benefit to have better bird's eye tracking. Because compared to the Z8 or even the Z52, it seems like the tracking is a little bit worse when it comes to birds in particular. So what are your thoughts on the situation? Do you think the bird's eye tracking will still come to the Z6 III, or is that something that will be exclusive to other cameras? A few days ago, Canon Rumors also released a new article showing a few patents that Canon lodged for an RF600 and an RF400mm f2.8 and f4 prime lenses with a built-in 1.4 extender. Now that would definitely be exciting, even though I'm not sure if Canon would actually just release lenses that are basically copies of what Nikon has done already. So while I think it would be amazing to have Canon primes with built-in teleconverters, I feel like Canon might be pushing things in a little bit different way, maybe like what Sigma has done with a 300-600mm lens, or we've talked about an f2.8 400 to f4 600mm zoom, and I feel like some of these lenses might seem a little bit more exciting to Canon, even though I feel like a boring f4 600mm lens with a 1.4 extender would also be quite amazing. Undoubtedly, all of these lenses would be very expensive, but I also think it could be something that could push our experience in the field even higher. Over the last few weeks, I've used the Canon R1 and the Sony A9 Mark III extensively in the field, and I must say, both of these cameras are kind of in a league of their own. What I love about the R1 is the overall amazing body design, how it feels in your hand, that amazing viewfinder, and also how easy it is to work with the autofocus. And when it comes to actually detecting small subject, especially perch birds like in a tree or bush for instance, Canon is second to none and is far ahead of Nikon and Sony in my opinion, both of which struggle a lot more to identify especially smaller subjects in the grass or in the trees. Now things change a little bit though when it comes to pre-capture and action autofocus, because here Sony and the A9 III in particular are basically second to none. Their pre-capture is a little bit ahead of Canon in my opinion because it can basically stay with any subject no matter in which direction it's taking off and track it very well. And whenever I use the A9 III in the field with the 120 frames per second and basically get 60-70 super sharp action shots in a row, I'm always amazed. So while Sony's autofocus and the subject detection in particular lack a little bit for perch birds, when it comes to action, they're basically second to none. Canon has also released a few firmware updates a little while ago for the R5 Mark II and the R1, but there was nothing major there. And also more recently for the RF 100 to 300mm lens, which amongst other things also brings autofocus improvements. So if you have one of these cameras or lenses, it's probably worthwhile to update. And lastly, it seems like DxO will also release a new version of PureRAW sometime in April. The good thing about this launch though is that it seems like if you buy PureRAW after the 27th of February, you will automatically be upgraded to the new version at launch. So you're not running the risk anymore of buying the old PureRAW and then having to suddenly buy the new PureRAW the next day, which was definitely one point of friction in the past and left many people unhappy who recently bought the old PureRAW and then were forced to upgrade when the new version came out. Are you guys still using DxO PureRAW, or what's your favorite noise reduction software at the moment? I still like using DxO PureRAW 4, but I've also been using more and more Adobe Enhance simply because it's so easy to just right-click in Photoshop and Lightroom and get great noise reduction results without having to use any other software. Overall, I think it's great to have new noise reduction softwares available because each new iteration gives us slightly better and improved results, which in turn allows us to shoot at higher ISOs and get even more images that were previously unimaginable. And on that note, I think it's a great time to wrap up this week's Early Bird Photo News. I hope you enjoyed the show. Let me know all your thoughts in the comments. Give me that thumbs up, check out my channel membership, my masterclasses, and hit that subscribe button. And I'll see you guys in another video very soon. And hopefully the cyclone won't be too bad. See you soon.